Center of Military History here in Washington, D.C. and around the country who work with me in the Army Historical Program. I'm glad you could all join us, but everybody who's joined in, I'm thrilled you're here. Hopefully one day soon we'll be back to having people walk this ground, but for now we will have a look at the history of Congressional Cemetery in a virtual way through Facebook. I always start my orientation tours here at the cemetery standing here in the original 4.5 acre plot of Congressional Cemetery. This is where the cemetery began in 1807, and it spreads out from here, but I start at this particular spot because behind me up against the gatehouse is the grave of Thomas Tingey. Thomas Tingey was an American Navy officer. This is him later in life, but Tingey not only was the officer in charge of the Washington Navy Yard in the early 19th century, but he was also a member of the Parish Council of Christ Church. And so we will walk over in this direction and talk about the origins of Congressional Cemetery. When Pierre L'Enfant laid out the original plan for Washington City, as it was called then, in the late 1790s, the original city plan did not include cemeteries, interestingly enough. And so after the establishment of the city and the federal government here in the 1790s, the city had to build burial grounds. They immediately built a western burial ground, which was out in what is now Georgetown, and they needed an eastern burial ground in this part of the city. The original burial site was north of us, in the area where the current H Street corridor runs in northeast DC. But that site was lower ground and it was prone to flooding. And so they needed a different spot right here. So we are now in southeast Washington, D.C. in what was called now the Hill East neighborhood. But if we look over in that direction, you see a range of hills, and below that is the Anacostia River. So we're on what was farmland when the original villages that comprised Washington City started to grow. This was farmland, unoccupied by residences. And so this was a natural spot for a cemetery. The Parish Council of Christ Church here in Washington Parish, which at the time the rector was Andrew T. McCormick, decided to enter an agreement with Washington City to purchase this plot of land to establish as a cemetery. The council raised $200. They paid that, they took out, purchased the land for $200, and then they sold 3x8 plots of cemetery ground here for private citizens to bury at the interesting rate of $2 a plot. 3x8 plots for $2 a plot. It took them from 1807, when the deed was initially taken out, until 1812 to sell all of the plots in the original 4.5 acre cemetery, which is bounded really by this area and the first sidewalk roads that goes down in the low ground there. And so we're standing in the original section of the cemetery. As I said, Thomas Tingey was one of the Parish Council of Christ Church, and so the original name of this burying ground was Washington Parish Burial Ground. And Thomas Tingey, as a local man of authority, Andrew T. McCormick, and others, once the debt was paid off, once the $200 was paid back, they gave the lease for the land to the parish, who operated it as Washington Parish Burial Ground. And so we're off and running with what will become in the future Congressional Cemetery, but more on that in a moment. You have all different kinds of grave styles in this cemetery. Congressional Cemetery is still a working cemetery, so you have some of the very earliest, which are crafted from sandstone, and you can see that they've degraded over time. You have some more modern granite memorials here, some from the 1950s. But then you have an interesting style here, which is a tomb that's constructed with a tabletop. This is because, especially as we move into the 19th century, cemeteries were seen as public spaces for outdoor recreation. And so many people, when they buried a loved one in a cemetery, would install just such a memorial so that they could literally use the grave top as a picnic table. And they could sit and they could have a meal and they could spend time outdoors in the fresh air with their loved ones. And so there's a lot of different styles here of funeral architecture, if you will, but more on that in a moment. So as we walk down here, we see that we have a cemetery that's composed of individual graves, but also of a lot of vaults. And these vaults are taken by families who construct them, and then they place the members of their family later in early Washington City, and owned much of the land on which residences were built in Washington City. Greenleaf's Point in southwestern DC, which is now where Audi Field and Fort McNair are located, was originally called, owned by James Greenleaf. Next to him we have Samuel Smallwood. Smallwood, again, is an emigre from Ireland, moves to Washington City, and was one of the supervisors of the construction of the Capitol building. So again, a founding father of the city. And then behind them, William Blagden was a Scottish stonecutter who cut on it. Congressional Cemetery is still an operating cemetery, so there are some 65,000 plus interments here in the cemetery, but it again is an operating cemetery. But this really impressive marble memorial in front of me here with the eternal flame coming out of the lamp on the top is the grave of Elbridge Gary. Elbridge Gary was a Massachusetts native who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and then during the War of 1812 served as James Madison's vice president. And so Elbridge Gary, one of the founding fathers, the only founding father and the only signer of the Declaration of Independence who's buried in Washington, D.C., in the D.C. area, is here at Congressional Cemetery. So he's got a really impressive memorial with this eternal flame coming out of the top. He's got his marker here from the Sons of the American Revolution. So an interesting spot. We know Elbridge Gary for a different reason than the historic reason, is that Elbridge Gary, as a congressman, after his term as vice president, was well known in Massachusetts for constructing electoral districts that allowed him to capitalize on votes and continue to be elected to Congress. And so a newspaper assembled a map of the districts that Gary had arranged in this way, and the design of those districts, or the layout of those districts on the map, looked to many people like a salamander. And so the wag who wrote that newspaper article and published that map called Gary's district a gerrymander. So we know that term now as our term of gerrymandering, which is the engineering of congressional districts to become elected. And that's really why a lot of us know who Elbridge Gary is, but those of us who are passionate about Congressional Cemetery know of him as one of our famous residents. But looking beside Gary's grave here, we have a number of grave markers that look alike, and you can see them cascading in a row down the hill. We've got a few more over in the corner there, and we've got another section of them over in the distance by the main road. These are cenotaphs, and so although this cemetery is founded as Washington Parish Burial Ground in 1812, in the course of the 19th century it becomes known as Congressional Cemetery, because the other main theme that runs through my tours here is that Congressional was Arlington before we had Arlington National Cemetery. It was our first national federal cemetery because Congress and the federal government needed a place to bury government officials who passed away here in Washington City. Remember, the early 19th century is before we have modern embalming technology, before we have high-speed transportation networks like rail around the country, and so you normally were interred in the early 19th century where you passed away. And so we have government officials who die in service in Washington City, and they have to be buried here. And so Congress will begin in the 1820s to take out plots in this cemetery to inter members of Congress and federal officials who have died here. And this is the design. It's designed by Benjamin Latrobe, who we also know as one of the main designers of the Capitol building. But Benjamin Latrobe designed the cenotaph, again, to mimic and reflect the design of the Capitol with its dome. So it's made out of sandstone, which is locally quarried at Aquia Creek down in Northern Virginia. It's got a top that resembles the Capitol dome, but they're all the same. These are in effect prefabricated funeral markers that are easy to construct. They're relatively resistant to the weather. You can see they're all in pretty good shape, and they're uniform in size and shape and design, so they're less expensive to purchase. And so these become the gravestones or the grave markers for federal officials, mainly senators and congressmen, who die in Washington City in the early 19th century. There are 165 of these cenotaphs here in Congressional Cemetery. About 80 of them are actually inhabited by their member of Congress. And that's because as the 19th century goes on, of course, we developed the technology to embalm bodies when they pass away so they can be transported by a train or a canal boat or a ship back to their home. And so by the 1850s, we start to see members of Congress, federal officials, being transported home for burial. But the tradition of establishing a cenotaph for them, and the word again means empty grave, will continue through the 19th century, really until 1877, when the process of establishing cenotaphs is formally discontinued. In the 1870s, a senator from Massachusetts commented that these had really fallen out of fashion in the 19th century, and they became more an object of scorn than anything else. And he said that being interred beneath a cenotaph gave an extra level of horror to death, because you knew you were interred in a place that just was not fashionable. So we have the cenotaphs, and we have in the course of the 19th century this place shift from being called Washington Parish Burial Ground to Congressional Cemetery. And the very first of the cenotaphs is over there to my left, and it's Senator Uriah Tracy of Connecticut, who's interred here in the 1820s. As I said, the latest are in the 1870s, but there is one addition to the rolls of the cenotaphs in the 20th century. In 1971, two congressmen, Boggs and Begich, are on a campaign trip to Alaska, and they perish in a plane crash, and their bodies were never recovered. And so their friend, Senator Tip O'Neill from Massachusetts, had cenotaphs constructed for them and dedicated in 1981. And so we have a real tie even today to our cenotaphs. But this is really one of those signature things that people know about Congressional Cemetery, and it really harkens to its role as our first federal cemetery. So let's walk in this direction. I'm going to slip between the markers here for a second. And I want to highlight a couple of graves here. In front of me is Pushmata. Pushmata was a Choctaw war chief. The Choctaw were a tribe in what is now the Deep South in the United States. Pushmata and his Choctaw Native Americans served with American forces in the War of 1812. Pushmata served with Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans in 1815. And so, after his service in the war, when Andrew Jackson had become a senator here in Washington City, Pushmata traveled to Washington City to argue for the rights of the Native American tribes, and during his time in Washington fell ill of croup and passed away. He asked on his deathbed that Senator Andrew Jackson grant him a full military honors funeral here in the city, and he asked that the big guns be fired over me, which for him symbolized that he was an American. And so he was buried with full military honors here in what became Congressional Cemetery, with a military salute fired by the Army's guns at the Capitol after his memorial ceremony. There is only one cenotaph in this cemetery that is the resting place of a of a non-federal official. And that's the cenotaph here in front of us in the shade, which is William Thornton. Again, a fascinating individual. Thornton was a physician. He was a scholar. During the War of 1812, was the master of the patent office in Washington, D.C., and he saved the patent office from destruction by standing in front of the doors and pushing away the British who wanted to burn the building, because he said that the patent office was the home of really our legacy of invention and manufacturing, and so why would you burn this down as fellow citizens of the Atlantic world? But earlier than that, interestingly enough, William Thornton was one of the personal physicians for George Washington. And on George Washington's deathbed, we know that George died of a throat malady related to pneumonia. At his death, he advised, as a really what we'd call a faith healer now, or a spiritualist, alternative medicine practitioner, he advised Martha Washington that he had a method to potentially bring George Washington back to life by giving him a blood transfusion with animal's blood. Of course, Martha politely declined that offer. But again, William Thornton is just one of the hundreds and hundreds of really fascinating stories that are here in Washington Parish Burial Ground, now Congressional Cemetery. Over here we see another example of an interesting sort of funeral marker. It's got a classical column at the top, which is sheared off at an angle. And of course that tells us that this is the marker of a person whose life was really cut short unexpectedly. And so again, an interesting style of grave architecture here in Congressional Cemetery. So let's walk this way. One of the challenges of doing an orientation tour here is that the graves are not chronologically organized. So it's really, without walking, tripling or quadrupling the amount of walking you're going to do, and we're going to keep this tour to an hour, it's pretty impossible to take the graves here in chronological order. So we're going to jump forward to the 20th century here for just a moment, and then we're going to jump back into the 19th century, go back in time a little more, and then come forward to the end, which can be kind of confusing, but again, that's part of the fun of here at Congressional Cemetery. Since we're doing this during the time of COVID-19, it's interesting to also note that there are a number of graves, of course, of DC residents here in the cemetery who were felled by the Spanish flu in 1918, 1919, and they're sprinkled throughout the cemetery, primarily in this side of the cemetery, which are some of the later, of course, graves into the 20th century. As we said, it's an active cemetery today. You can see that the cemetery is maintained by a really incredible staff of groundskeepers, of mechanics, of landscapers who keep this place really shining. A number of the graves now are adopted by members of the Historic Congressional Cemetery Society, who maintain them at their own expense, which is another interesting aspect of the cemetery. But here to my right, we've got number 2 on my list of the big 4 here at Congressional Cemetery, of course. This is J. Edgar Hoover, the founder of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. J. Edgar Hoover was a Capitol Hill resident. He was born near what is now Eastern Market, lived his youth on the Hill, attended law school at George Washington University, got his law degree, took up a job with the Department of Justice here in Washington, D.C., and founded the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So the modern FBI has dedicated the wrought iron fence around it with the FBI seal, of course, on the gate, and the nice metal bench here. They routinely bring graduates of the FBI Academy, so the newest FBI agents, here to the grave of J. Edgar Hoover just to mark the spot. Again, opinions and stories about J. Edgar Hoover, of course, vary really widely. I think we can all agree that he's a fascinating American story that is told here at Congressional Cemetery. So one of my places that's always a stop on the orientation tour. But over here you see in the distance, you see 2 marble, beautiful memorials. One of a downcast maiden deep in thought, and the other of an angel. This is the family plot for the Hall family. These are three women, their mother and two daughters, who were residents of D.C., Washington City in the 19th century. And it brings us to the topic of really, that there are so many. Washington, D.C. is such a diverse place even now, and Congressional Cemetery is a diverse place too. And we have the stories of all of these different groups whose stories are now really only being told now in modern times. One of those groups, of course, is women. We know that women didn't attain the right to vote until 1919, but women were a thriving part of the culture and the business and life in Washington City through all time, but interestingly enough, in the 19th century, and here we have the grave on the right of Mary Ann Hall. So we see the mother, Elizabeth, and we see the daughter, Catherine, here under the angel, and we see Mary Ann in her own, with her own marker, with the contemplative maiden on the top. So why did Mary Ann have her own marker, and why did she not have the angel on top? Interesting story. Mary Ann Hall owned a business in Civil War Washington. She owned what was reputed to be the largest, busiest, and classiest brothel in Washington City during the American Civil War. At this time, prostitution was a legal business, and during the war, this was a wartime city with thousands and thousands of soldiers passing through, and so prostitution was a legal and thriving business. There were a number of brothels along the stretch of what is now Constitution Avenue and Pennsylvania Avenue between the Capitol and the White House, and on Independence Avenue at the site of what is now the Museum of the Native American stood Mary Ann Hall's business, her brothel. It was a large business, and she became very wealthy as a result. When Mary Ann Hall passed away in 1896, she was worth about $2 million in current amounts. So she was a millionaire. She ran a great business, highly regarded, and when the Museum of the American Indian was excavated, the site was excavated for the building of the museum, they found the trash pit of the museum under the building, and that trash pit was filled with china, and it was filled with champagne corks, because every transaction at Mary Ann Hall's brothel began with the customer and his business mate sharing a bottle of champagne. And so, and they served the good stuff. So they served Piper Heidsieck champagne from France, and that's where all the corks came from, in that trash pit. But even Mary Ann Hall would not want to have an angel on top of her grave marker. Even she acknowledged that the optics of that would probably not be the best. And so instead, she has the woman contemplating life on top of her stone with her mother and sister under an angel next to them. But again, Mary Ann Hall is a window into the life of women in Washington City, and one of the specialized tours that are on offer on the museum's, on the cemetery's website and its blog is a tour of women's graves here in Congressional Cemetery. But it's, again, it's just one of the most interesting stories here, and this place is filled with interesting stories. So I'd like to address, now that we talk about groups whose stories haven't always been told over time, let's talk about African Americans in Washington City. The original founding documents of Washington Parish Burial Ground specified that no persons of African descent would be interred within the fenced boundaries of the original cemetery. So we're talking about the original 4.5-acre plot of the cemetery, which probably started here along this sidewalk and went out to the front gate. So no African Americans interred in that section of the cemetery. That does not mean that there were not several hundred African Americans interred in this cemetery over time. Even in the time of the antebellum era, the era of slavery, and many of them are here in this section of the cemetery. So a couple of things stand out to you. Number one, there aren't a lot of stones here because a lot of these African Americans were interred here in unmarked graves in a section of the cemetery that was not as desirable because it's a low part. You can see that there is low ground running through here. That's a natural creek that runs beneath the surface of the cemetery, and in fact there are remains of a maintenance tunnel that's been constructed under this area later in the 19th century. But you have a number of unmarked African American graves and some marked African American graves here in this cemetery. And one of them that we always like to talk about is Lucy Bell. Lucy Bell was born into slavery during the American Revolution in Prince George's County, Maryland, on a tobacco farm. She lived in slavery through her childhood and then purchased her freedom around the turn of the century into the early 19th century, and lived in the Washington City area as a free black woman for her entire life. Passed away in 1895. She had 5 children, and she made a life for herself in a place that was on the border between slavery and freedom, literally. We know that antebellum Washington City, although it was the capital of the nation, and of course the capital of the federal United States during the Civil War, in effect Washington City was a very southern place. Slavery was legal in the bounds of the city, and until President Lincoln outlawed it in the bounds of the city, it was carried on widely by both Northerners and Southerners in Washington City. So you had a population of free blacks living and working side by side with slaves in this area. And so when we do, for example, our Civil War tours here in Congressional Cemetery, we always start with the story of people like Lucy Bell, because this is the cause of the American Civil War, and that cause, that tension between slavery and freedom, is laid out and it's described in physical terms here in Congressional Cemetery. Lucy Bell's story of that, or that of her family, gets very interesting in 1846 because her son Daniel is a leader of what becomes the largest peaceful slave revolt or escape attempt in American history. In 1846, he and a number of his friends who were free blacks here in Washington City raised money to rent a ship, the SS Pearl. It's a freighter. They sail it, or they have it sailed from Baltimore down to Washington City, and in 1846, April of 1846, they will attempt an escape of 77 free blacks. They will gather at the docks down near the Navy Yard. They will board the Pearl, and they sail down the Potomac River, and with the intent of going out to the bay, north to New York City in freedom. After they depart Washington City, and we'll wait a moment for the helicopter to go over. A few hours after the Pearl departs Washington City, the owners of these some of the escaped slaves, some of whom, the group of 77 was composed of both free blacks and escaped slaves. The owners of some of the escaped slaves on the ship learn of their departure. They figure out through various folks where the Pearl is headed, and they engage with the ship to chase them down the Potomac River, and they catch them at the mouth of the river at the Chesapeake Bay while they are waiting for a fair wind to carry them north to New York City. They catch the Pearl and the folks who were on the ship, and they return them to Washington City, and they carry all of the slaves and a number of the free blacks on the ship back into bondage. And so you have a number of lawyers who are interred here in Congressional Cemetery, who white lawyers who fight for the defense of the free blacks who are in the Pearl. But again, a sad ending to an interesting story, But I always tell the story of Lucy Bell because she and her children made a life for themselves as free blacks in a city that was really on the front line of the coming of our great, of course, national tragedy, the American Civil War. And with that, let's continue. We are at about 33 minutes, so I know the clock is ticking on me. I've got about 27 minutes to get to the places that I want to show you here in the cemetery. So it's probably time for us to do a bit of a walk and talk. I will show you back behind us. You will see a four-way intersection of the cemetery with some more modern gravestones. This is called LGBTQ Corner. This is the only known cemetery in the world with a dedicated LGBTQ section. And it's got one really interesting story that I, as a military historian, always tell, and that is the story of Leonard Matlovich. Leonard's grave is right at the intersection there. Leonard was an Air Force technical sergeant who served 3 tours in Vietnam, earned a Purple Heart for a wound in battle and a Bronze Star, and served again honorably in the Air Force. When he returned to the United States in 1974, he became connected with the gay rights movement. He was stationed at Travis Air Force Base in Northern California, became connected with the gay rights movement in San Francisco, and they urged him to become an early test case for the service of gay citizens in the U.S. military. And so the next year, in 1975, Leonard Matlovich informed his commanding officer that he was in fact homosexual. And so Leonard was immediately discharged dishonorably from the Air Force because that was against regulations to be gay and be in the military at the time. Leonard promptly sued the federal government for restitution. His discharge was almost immediately upgraded to honorable by the Secretary of the Air Force, but the discharge remained. This was not corrected until 1980, when he was reinstated to the Air Force at his full original rank, and then in 1987, I believe, died of AIDS. But along with Harvey Milk, Leonard Matlovich is known as one of the founders of the gay rights movement in America. Of course, again, in the military, the service of people like Leonard leads to, of course, during the Clinton era, the don't ask, don't tell policy, which again is fashioned and is really, it's a preparatory step to today, the full and honorable service of LGBTQ Americans in their military. And so that's a story that's got a personal impact for me, and I always highlight it on our orientation tour here at Congressional Cemetery.
We have a question from the audience about Hoover's aide. Isn't he buried over in that area as well?
That's a true statement. He is. And you caught me. I can't remember his name, but he is interred there very near Clyde
Tolson.
Clyde Tolson, yes. Thank you. All right. We have in front of us, under the shade tree here, the public vault here at Congressional Cemetery. So most of these vaults are family vaults, and you can see their names on them, and you can see the memoriams and the memorial messages on them. But this is a public vault. So in addition to being able to purchase a grave plot here at Congressional or at Washington Parish Burial Ground, in the early 19th century, you could purchase a spot in the vault for a lesser amount of money, and this was a way for lower income people to have a place that they could call a permanent resting home. And so the public vault is here. A number of famous residents, though, occupied the public vault on a temporary basis. The most famous of these is probably Dolly Madison. So the wife, the first lady of James Madison, died shortly after the War of 1812, but she died penniless because her son, John Payne Todd, had served as a member of the commission who went to Europe to complete the signing of the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the War of 1812. But John Payne Todd was a party guy. He was a ne'er-do-well. He enjoyed the pleasures, the social pleasures of Europe, if you will, and he bankrupted his family. in the course of his time working for the federal government. And so Dolly Madison died penniless. So for a period of a couple of years, was interred in the public vault because her family had no money to inter her with her husband, James Madison, at Montpelier, their home in Western Virginia. But Congress and the nation later raised the funds to have Dolly Madison moved out. Initially, she was moved from the public vault to the Costin family vault behind you because, again, they knew they were friends of the first family in D.C., again, prominent citizens, and they really believed that it was a shame to have Dolly Madison in the public vault. So they moved her into their own vault for a time while they completed the transfer of the remains to Montpelier, where she rests today with James Madison. But today, the public vault is used by Congressional Cemetery for a number of their really cool social events. So there are a number of events throughout the year you can check out on their website. We do things like yoga mortis, which is yoga in the cemetery. We do goat yoga, baby goat yoga, which is one of the most popular things that sells out every time, instantly. At Halloween, we do soul strolls, where costumed interpreters walk around the cemetery at night and tell the stories of the residents here in Congressional Cemetery. We do cinematary, where we show movies at the chapel during the summer, and you bring a lawn chair out. We do concerts in the chapel, all kinds of neat events here at Congressional Cemetery. So check out the website, definitely, and get to Congressional Cemetery when we are back open and operating. All right, so I'm going to diverge into my military history nerdiness for a moment because I am standing in 1812 corner. Of course, the War of 1812, misunderstood. Not a lot is known about it today, but the War of 1812, of course, really is chapter 2 of the American Revolution, and it's our second war with Great Britain, which kicks off in 1812 over a number of issues. But the War of 1812, of course, occurs before the American Civil War, which created really the establishment of Arlington National Cemetery. So as I said, this was Arlington before Arlington, and you have here in this little corner of the cemetery really the largest concentration I know of the graves of War of 1812 U.S. military leaders. And so we have a couple of Navy senior officers and we have a couple of Army generals here in the cemetery. This is the obelisk for John Rogers and his wife and son. But John Rogers was an American naval officer who sailed from New York City in June of 1812, a matter of 3 weeks after the signing of the Declaration of War, with the idea that he's going to get after it and he's going to find the British at sea and he's going to begin the war. And so John Rogers fires what are probably the first shots of the War of 1812 in late June of 1812 down in the Caribbean when he finds a British supply convoy in the Caribbean Sea, and he fires on it. And so John Rogers, again, leads the Navy through the War of 1812. We've got next to him, we've got Daniel Patterson, again, a Commodore in the U.S. Navy, which is a senior rank of an admiral who commands a number of ships on deployment in combat. And then flanking these Navy officers, we have 2 Army generals. So we go right behind the camera with Sarah, and we have the grave of Alexander Macomb. Next to him, we have over on this side, you see the column again with the angled cut depicting the life cut short. We have the grave of Jacob Brown. So Jacob Brown and Alexander Macomb, immediately after the War of 1812, serve as the commanding generals of the United States Army. At the time, the precedence meant that if you were the senior serving general in terms of your list, your rank on the list, in terms of serving the time served in the Army, you would be, as the senior general, you would be the commanding general of the Army. And so Jacob Brown is not a regular. Jacob Brown is a Quaker from New York State who serves as a general of the New York State militia in upstate New York, the main ground theater of the War of 1812. But after the war, his political capital has grown to the point where a militia officer can become the commanding general of the United States Army, and he serves, as his stone says, as a warrior until his death. Immediately after his death, he is succeeded by the next senior American general, who is Alexander Macomb. But Alexander Macomb is a regular. Alexander Macomb entered the United States Army in 1801. So the American Revolution is less than a decade in the past. He enters the Army in 1801, and his first duty assignment is at the United States Army's engineer headquarters at West Point, New York. The same year, First Lieutenant Alexander Macomb becomes really, in effect, one of the first students of what will become the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, which is founded by President Thomas Jefferson in 1802. So that's all interesting enough. But even if you're not a military historian, this is a really interesting grave, and I think it's probably the most interesting grave in the cemetery for a number of reasons, because we could do a class with this grave on funeral iconography. So let's start at the top. We've got at the top, so this is a grave of a general. So at the top, it's crowned by a Spartan military helmet. Below it is a cape, which a general would wear over his uniform. And below it, of course, is a sword with oak leaves around it. Again, symbols of high military rank. The top of the obelisk is held up by sets of lion's paws. Just really, really interesting. What I always do is turn this into a quiz with my on-site tours, and I ask people what they think this means here. So we have a sickle, we have a sheaf of wheat, and we have a winged hourglass. So what are we getting at here with this iconography? Really what we're getting at are those ideas that really death is the end of all life, of course, but that also that time flies. You know, that this is the passage of human life. But around the other side, we've got just a simple Christian cross here. And then over on this side, you've got a snake encircled, eating its own tail, but also in the middle is a butterfly. So we symbolize really eternal life here and regeneration that comes, you know, from a moth becoming a butterfly. But it's just an interesting family, but made a decision in the early republic that he was going to be an officer in the New York State Militia. And so, you know, that's a great question, actually, because studio in New York City. Later, at the beginning of the Civil War, moved his operation to Washington City, of course, because he saw money in doing portraits of officials, of soldiers, and lots of others. But he's probably most famous for two things. Matthew Brady was a war photographer, and so he created the industry of photographing battlefields in the early era, and his photographic show called The Dead of Antietam in 1862 was really the first time that American citizens had seen the dead of a battle, especially on their own soil. So this had a cataclysmic effect on the American public. But then also Matthew Brady did a number of the portraits of famous Americans, of course including Abraham Lincoln. And so probably his most famous portrait was the cracked plate negative of the portrait of Abraham Lincoln that's taken just a number of days before Lincoln's assassination, that becomes the model for the $5 bill. I'm first and foremost a Civil War historian, so I always focus on Civil War stories here in Congressional Cemetery, and of course Matthew Brady is one of those. He dies penniless and blind from his darkroom chemicals. And it's not until 1954 that the Library of Congress will purchase Brady's photographic collection for the nation, and that's why it's now available on the Library of Congress website for free, because that's part of our legacy that was purchased by the federal government. Thank goodness. But over here, as we move, you're going to see the tallest of the memorial installations here in Congressional Cemetery, and it's another Civil War story. So Washington, D.C., of course, was a wartime city during the Civil War. Down in southwest D.C., just a few hundred yards from my current office, where I work at the U.S. Army Center of Military History at Fort McNair, stood the original bounds of the Washington City Arsenal, which was the federal arsenal that made lots of artillery pieces, of ammunition, that processed gunpowder for the federal war effort. And so a number, probably most of the workforce at the federal arsenal consisted of women. And again, another interesting women's story in D.C. Many of the women who worked at the arsenal were Irish immigrants. These are teenage women, women in their early 20s who are literally just off the boat from Ireland, who work in the war industries at the Washington City Arsenal. This was dangerous work. They worked with black powder, which is a very volatile substance. And on June 17, 1864, in the midst of the war, of course, we know, residents of D.C. know what it's like here in June. It's hot. It's very, very hot. There was an accident in one of the buildings that fabricated weapons cartridges. A number of women are working at a long table in a building, assembling cartridges with gunpowder. Outside the window, another staff member of the arsenal had laid a group of black powder fireworks to dry in the sun, which sounds insane to us now, but it was a common practice in the 18th century. These were fireworks meant for displays, meant for celebrations. They were laid out in a spot that was off the beaten path, and it was sunny so that the powder could dry, but it was against the building. The heat during that day grew so hot that the black powder in the fireworks began to ignite itself. Some of the sparks from the ignition flew into an open window into the fabrication building where 22 Irish immigrant women were working at that table, and it blew the building to smithereens. It initiated a fire that consumed the building. This is a picture of the building after the explosion with the top, which is a sketch of what it would have looked like inside. But the women inside were almost to a woman were burned to death. A single digit number, a small number of women actually got out of the building and lived. A couple died of wounds later, but 22 of the women were killed outright in the explosion. This is the memorial to them. It was constructed by Mr. Lot Flannery, who was a major stonemason and designer of memorials and monuments in Washington City, to honor the 18 of the 22 who were interred here in Congressional Cemetery. It has on one side in bas relief a picture of the explosion, and it's got on the top, of course, a mourning maiden looking down on the women with the wheat growing up the sides of the obelisk. But again, we've got a winged hourglass here on the top, again showing us that time flies. Beneath it is a stone marking a return visit by the government of the Republic of Ireland in 2014 on the 150th anniversary of the explosion to rededicate the stone. And then what I like around the bottom is that we have memorial bricks that were done, many of them, by the original group of docents for Congressional Cemetery called the Dozen Decent Docents. So there's a lot more than a dozen of us now, but I think we're pretty decent too. So this is, again, one of our prime spots here in the cemetery, which is the memorial to the Arsenal explosion of June 1864. I think I've managed to get us back on time. I want to mention, as we walk to number 4 on our list of the 4 famous residents, I want to mention a couple of interesting graves that we won't see. Over toward the gatehouse is the grave of Elaine Locke. Elaine Locke was the first African American to earn a Rhodes Scholarship and was the father of the Harlem Renaissance. And so the arts Renaissance that kicked off in the African American community in Harlem, New York City in the early 20th century. Elaine Locke is interred here. He was a Washington native and is interred here. To our right here is the grave of Thomas Lantos. Tom Lantos was the only Holocaust survivor elected to the U.S. Congress. And so another place that I always like to point out. It's really pretty today. I wish everybody that was online with us could be here because it's gorgeous. This is one of those Chamber of Commerce days for DC. So here we are at big number 4, but probably number 1 in the hearts and minds of a lot of people. Of course, John Philip Sousa. So John Philip Sousa, of course, known as the March King, was the leader of the U.S. Marine Band for 12 years, 1880 to 1892. But for our purposes, John Philip Sousa is a Capitol Hill resident. He was born and raised around the corner from the current Marine Barracks at 8th and I, and was enlisted in the Marines, not by his own volition, but by his father, who basically said, son, if you don't join the Marines, you're going to be dead before you're age 20 because you like to misbehave. And so John Philip Sousa was forcibly enlisted in the Marines by his dad. He becomes the band leader of the Marines, and of course, has composed all of the famous marches, you know, the Washington Post March, Stars and Stripes Forever, all of those. But his entire family is here with him in his plot at Congressional Cemetery. Every year on John Philip Sousa's birthday, the Marine Band parades over from 8th and I. They march here, they do a little concert at the grave, and they march back. So something to look out for when we are back to moving around. This really nice, beautiful, shady walkway that we're on now is the Washington, D.C. 9/11 Memorial Walk. And so this was a way for our city, of course, to remember and honor of course, the dead of 9/11 in the Pentagon attack, but also just more broadly to remember 9/11 and to keep the memory of that time alive, and the people that lived here lost it. Of course, the Pentagon, world's largest office building, headquarters of the U.S. Department of Defense, a number of the hundreds and hundreds of military members who perished in the attack had family in this area. That's of course the Pentagon and the DoD are just a natural, unique, integral part of the culture here. And I say that as a Department of the Army civilian and married to an Army officer. But we are approaching a totem pole. This totem pole was dedicated to Washington, D.C. by the Lummi Nation, L-U-M-M-I, which is a Pacific Northwest Native American tribe, in honor of the Pentagon and the dead of the attack there on 9/11. The original intent was that the totem pole would be placed at what is now the Pentagon 9/11 Memorial at the side of the Pentagon where the jet hit. The totem pole was brought here for safekeeping while they prepared the site, but it just became apparent that this was a really nice place for this totem pole because it's again, I'm certainly not an expert on Native American iconography, but I do know that the two sides of the totem pole again depict war and peace, and so it's a unique, again, aspect of the diversity of our city of Washington, D.C. and it's where I always like to end my tours. Just over behind us, behind that cedar tree, is the grave of another fascinating person, Belva Lockwood, of course, who was the first woman to appear on a major U.S. presidential political party ticket in 1884. She's an early suffragette, and she is also the first American woman ever to earn a law degree and to argue before the Supreme Court. And so her law license, in effect, is signed by President Ulysses S. Grant. So she's here in Congressional Cemetery, too. Again, we are at an hour, and I have only literally scratched the surface of just the tons of fascinating stories here. But, all the way from Thomas Tingey and the early 1800s to September 11th and after, this cemetery is just a vibrant slice of Washington, D.C. history and life, and American history and life, and I can't recommend it highly enough to you. The website and the app have all of the tours, the self-guided topical tours that we have available for the different subjects in the cemetery. Again, there are more stories than you can count. And with the sounding of the alarm test at the DC jail, I will sign off from Congressional Cemetery. It's been great to have you with us, and please come visit us again when you can. Bye.